A young woman comes home to visit her parents. She brings with her her boyfriend, this time a serious relationship, to meet the family. Sitting opposite one another, the father and the boyfriend are seated in the living room. The father asks the boyfriend, and he says, "What do you do for a living?" The boyfriend says, I'm learning in yeshiva. The father says, "Well, but what are you going to do to make money? How will you make a living for yourself?" The boyfriend says, "God will provide." The father says, "Well, at some point you're going to want to buy a house or, put down roots. How are you going to be able to do that if you're learning in yeshiva?" The boyfriend says, "God will provide." Father says, "At some point you'll want to have children. You'll want to be able to give them an education. How are you going to pay for the education for your children? How are you going to make a life in the style that my daughter is accustomed to?" And the yeshiva Behar once again throws up his hands and says, "No, God will provide." I hope you're enjoying this beautiful Erev Shabbos. I hope you and your family are well and safe. It's an old joke, but it speaks a truth, because the fact of the matter is that living our lives on faith that God will provide is not easy. Torah is full of stories that address the challenge of trusting in God's benevolence. In just a few weeks, we'll read the Parsha of Shalach Lecha, story of Moses sending the spies out to scout out Eretz Canaan. When they come back, God punishes the people for lacking the faith that God will bring them into the promised land safely. A couple of weeks later in our Parsha, Moses suffers the consequences that result from not believing that God can produce water from even a rock. Not everyone can be a Nachshon who bravely stepped into the waters of the Yam Suf, the Red Sea, as the rest of the Israelites stood on the shores. The Midrash tells us that his faith was so strong that he waded into the waters up to his nose before the sea split and Israel crossed over. Having that kind of faith is what God asks of us in this week's double Parsha of Behar Bechukoti. The Parsha opens with these words, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Behar Sinai Lemor. God speaks to Moses on Mount Sinai, and he says to him, Daber b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, he says, Ki tavo la'aretz asher ani noten lachem, v'shav ta'aretz Shabbat l'Adonai. When you enter into the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Shabbat to Adonai. Parsha then continues to outline the instructions that God gives to Moses for allowing the land to rest every seventh year. The entire land has to rest. No sowing the ground, no reaping the produce. All of these activities with the land are forbidden in the land of Israel. If you're living in Israel in ancient times, when the society is more heavily based on agriculture, and in modern times too, you're going to worry about how will you survive when you have to let the earth go for an entire year. How will you feed yourself and your family? How will you have an income? And it's not just the seventh year, it begins already in the sixth year. And since you can't plant during the seventh year, it continues into the eighth year. How will you survive? Well, the Torah has the answer. God will provide. Actually, the Torah says almost precisely this. Just a few verses later, it says, V'chi tomru ma nochel b'shana shvi'it. And when you ask, what are we to eat in the seventh year, if we may neither sow nor gather our crops? It goes on to say, God says to the people of Israel, I will ordain my blessing for you in the sixth year, so that its yield shall have sufficient crop for 3 years, for the sixth, seventh, and eighth year. That's reassuring to all of the Israelites, but in many ways, you'd like to have a backup plan. Many years ago in Muncie, where many Hasidim live and where the style is primarily black pants and black jacket, walking at night can be dangerous. And so some years ago, somebody came up with a sash type of reflector. You wore it across your chest, and it had words printed on the reflector that said, "Ein li amil yismoch ele HaKadosh Baruch Hu." You have only to rely on the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Presumably, if you're living in Muncie, you have a great deal of personal faith. But just in case, wear this reflector so that you don't get run over. The 19th century Polish head of the Volozhin Yeshiva, Rebbe Yehuda Tzvi Berlin, also known as the Netziv, writes in his commentary on the Torah, Amek Davar. He shares his perspective on this verse, and he says, referring to God's promise, he says, Bemet, Eino ele ma'aseh nes. In truth, this is none other than a miracle. In a year without any planting, the grain and the fruit of the trees will grow enough to satiate the entire population for 3 years. But then he goes on to say, V'yadua, shederech nes eino rawi lefi ha'achana. It is known that the path to miracles is only appropriate to the extent that one prepares for it. In other words, look for miracles, keep praying, but don't forget that you have a role to play as well. Truth be told, it's hard to have perfect faith. Even Moses and Abraham and Sarah, of our people, even they struggle with it. We do what we can to control the world around us. We hedge our bets, we create backup plans. But in the end, the real lesson of Shemitah is brought to us in this week's Parsha, of letting go of the ground every 7 years, and for that matter, resting ourselves every 7th day on the Shabbat. The real lesson in that is that you may think you're in control, but in the end, God will provide. Shabbat Shalom.